So, in this course, we are talking about critical thinking. We're learning how to become critical thinkers, but we have to ask ourselves, what is it to know something in the first place? If I'm supposed to discern between a good thought and a better thought, or a good thought and a bad thought, what is it that I'm kind of assessing this against in the first place? What is it that makes something more correct than something else? That set of questions, what makes something correct, an idea correct, is called epistemology. It is the study of how we humans come to know what is true, right, good, correct, accurate in the world. So it gives us the study of the nature, origin, and scope of knowledge, to know. So the word is epistemology. There are two basic forms of creating knowledge within the larger study of epistemology, or the larger practice of epistemology. One is deductive reasoning, and the next one on the next slide is going to be inductive reasoning. Deductive reasoning involves the process of starting from a premise that you know already to be true. So an idea or a fact that you already know to be true, and then drawing valid conclusions based on that premise and applying them to a logical process that would take you someplace else. So here's an example of how deductive reasoning takes place. You start from the premise of something like, all humans are mortal. And then you move on and say, okay, if that's true, then Beyonce is human. If all humans are mortal and Beyonce is a human, then Beyonce must be mortal. Even though she seems like she's goddess, she's actually mortal because she's human. This is the kind of logical reasoning that is called deductive reasoning or deduction. And in the various disciplines of knowledge, there are two branches that tend to use deductive reasoning the most. Others do as well, but most commonly this is used by mathematics and by philosophy, often also by theology, by religious studies. So as opposed to deductive reasoning, we also have inductive reasoning. It's another process by which we can come up with something to know, to hang our hats on, to believe in. So induction is deriving generalizations or principles from a body of empirical observations. What is empirical? Empirical means something that you're able to see and poke and be certain of in the real world. So empirical means it exists outside your own head, and you're able to both interact with it and gain information from it outside yourself. So deductive reasoning that we went over last time, it can happen all inside your head. You can start with a true premise, and then you can move forward to something else from that, all inside yourself. But inductive reasoning requires that you go outside and observe and collect data from the empirical world and bring it back in and analyze it to create new forms of knowledge, analyze it to figure out what is true. So here's an example of inductive reasoning. Based on his 40,000 career points and his higher per game average on rebounds, assists, and turnovers, we must conclude that LeBron James is the superior player to Michael Jordan. So if you take all this data on the games and you take these stats, LeBron James is just empirically, based on the available data, he's a better player than Michael Jordan. I know not all of you agree with me. Facts are facts. Inductive reasoning, LeBron James. So there are many branches of knowledge that rely primarily on deductive reasoning. Primarily on inductive reasoning. Those include history, the social sciences like my discipline, anthropology, the biological sciences, the physical sciences like chemistry, and then all of these are applied through through disciplines like engineering, etc. So these are all based on a scientific process called inductive reasoning. So within the sciences, there is a very specific process called the scientific method that is a specific form of inductive reasoning. And the scientific method, which helps us get to empirical forms of knowledge, how we know what we know, epistemology. The scientific method is something you've probably learned about in school growing up and encountered many times. So this is just a refresh for you since it's an intro course. Let's get us all on the same page to know what the scientific method is as we refer to it. So the scientific method requires that you first start with the empirical knowledge itself. You go out in the world and you notice things, you make observations about how the world is, you encounter interesting facts, and then you think of interesting questions to ask about those observations that you've made. So things like, okay, what does this mean? Is this a pattern? How would I tell how this is connected to that? And then based on the questions you ask about the empirical world and the things that you observe in the empirical world, you initially formulate what is called, or create what is called, a hypothesis. So it is your temporary answer to the question that you asked about the things that you encountered out there in the world. You formulate that hypothesis, or your idea of what you think the answer is, and then you develop a method of testing whether or not your idea, your hypothesis, is correct or not. So you come up with a series of things to do to test the correctness of it. And you go through those series of things, and if it turns out that your hypothesis, your idea, is true, great, you move on. If not, you go back and you change your hypothesis a little bit, you reconfigure it, and you test it again. And then perhaps you reconfigure it and you test it again until you find that through refining your hypothesis, you come up with the right answer, the right idea, because in fact, the data that you are coming up with through the test support and confirm what you thought to be true when you went into the test in the first place. So based on this process of testing your hypothesis, refining it, retesting, refining, retesting, refining until you come up with the right answer, you then develop a more general theory about how things are in the world. And you continue that process of observing things and coming up with interesting questions and interesting hypotheses and tests to be certain that your hypothesis is correct, in a way that constantly helps scientific knowledge to evolve and progress, so that we are ever expanding what we know about the universe around us. This is the scientific method. It's a form of, again, empirical induction. So far in the books we've been reading, we have encountered, as I'm sure you have noticed, many scientists who have done very poor science. So if there's this system in place of inductive reasoning that's supposed to help us test and come up with the best answer for the questions that we ask about what's out there in the world, why is there all of this bad science? And kind of more importantly, why are all of these famous studies that we're coming upon actually wrong? How is that possible? That's what I want to think about and sort of deal with in this video. So let's remind ourselves first of some of the bad science we've come up upon so far in this class. So you'll remember, of course, Frederick Lindemann from World War II. He was working under Winston Churchill, and he convinced Churchill, who's here in this picture, to bomb civilians in cities in Germany by telling him that it would break the morale of the German people and it would bring the war to a shorter close. But the truth was that he had evidence to the contrary. He'd sent out psychiatrists to see if English people who had been bombed had in fact lost their morale and were more depressed and willing to submit more readily to the Germans. And he found it was just the opposite. The people who got bombed actually had more zeal to fight than people who had not been bombed. But he ignored this otherwise good science. So his scientists did good science for him, but he ignored that science. So Frederick Lindemann is guilty of, as we've talked about several times already, he's guilty of confirmation bias, of rejecting information, evidence based on good science, and instead moving forward with what he already believes to be true. Confirmation bias. And then we met, of course, the anthropologist Raymond Dart, who looked at some bones of Australopithecus africanus, and he interpreted them to say that, oh, clearly this individual was killed by the violent use of weapons of other proto-humans. So proto-humans were violent and warlike, just like I would assume, based on, and that question, what is that based on? This is based on an availability bias. If you'll recall, the idea that humans evolved out of something more violent and brutish, and that race, in fact, is part of a human evolution that brought us to some better version of humanity in the form of white Europeans. So he was operating within that worldview, within that availability bias of the single story of white Europeans and colonists being more advanced, less brutal, less violent, more civilized than other people in the world. And he then used these ancient bones as part of that single story to try and support that single story. So I just want to show you some of the context in which Raymond Dart was operating visually, and I want to just let you know that the next little slide is not, it's very racist, not pretty, so if that's something you want to skip, you might want to fast forward. So Raymond Dart wrote his famous study only about 25 years after a very famous poem written by Rudyard Kipling. He is the man who wrote The Jungle Book and a lot of other famous stories like oh, I forgot some of them, but anyway, Rudyard Kipling was a famous writer from the late 1800s. He also wrote a poem in honor of the Queen's Golden Jubilee that he called The White Man's Burden. And in this poem, he claimed that white Europeans were more civilized than other humans around the world, and therefore they needed to go out and colonize in order to help to civilize other humans. So if you see at the bottom of this picture, which was used to illustrate Rudyard Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden, Uncle Sam and the Brits are carrying these caricatured and highly racialized others on their backs over things like oppression, ignorance, vice, barbarism, superstition, brutality, and it's going to carry them, they're going to carry them on past slavery, cruelty, cannibalism, and ignorance on towards civilization. This is, of course, highly racist, but also ironic because they're carrying them over slavery when slavery was in fact something that they largely imposed on these peoples and not vice versa. But you see the ideas, and these are the ideas in which Raymond Dart is operating, and you can see why Raymond Dart would want to show that proto-humans were even more racist and violent, even more violent and brutish than humans today, because it's part of this story of progress towards civilization that supports the rule of the rest of the world by white Europeans and North Americans. So this is a form of availability bias that then inflicted itself on his science. Then we have the example of Napoleon Chagnon, who interpreted his interactions with the Yanomamo peoples as evidence that hunter-gatherers are actually very violent, and the more violent you are, the more likely you are to have more children. So Chagnon actually was an example of really poor science, even though he was a super famous, probably the most read anthropologist of all time, super famous. The reason why he was involved in such bad science, in part, was because inductive reasoning means you go out and observe what happens in the world. You bring in data that you observe, and you're not supposed to actually influence the thing that you're observing. You're supposed to stand apart from it. Otherwise, your biases about that thing are going to influence the experiment that you are supposed to be engaged in. Well, Chagnon, in fact, did not just observe, he went out and handed out hatchets to the Yanomamo people. And he also did very poor mathematics and did not include all of the people that he should and their children. And so he came up with faulty conclusions about who was more likely to have more children over time, the violent or the non-violent. And Chagnon was picked up, if you recall, and circulated widely by the news media because his ideas were kind of shocking. He had this story of the brutality of humans, brutality of hunter-gatherers that was salacious enough that people were interested in reading it, and therefore it got a lot of airtime, even though it was inaccurate compared to all of the other many studies that were out there by anthropologists showing that hunter-gatherers are very peaceful. And then we have, of course, the psychologist Steven Pinker, who we talked about last week, who claimed that humans are evolving over time to become less and less violent through the civilizing force of society, that society makes us better, and we are ever improving over time. And he was analyzing, as you recall, archaeological and anthropological evidence, but he was trained as an experimental psychologist. Very famous one, but an experimental psychologist. So, what was he famous of? I'm making lots of little faux pas as I make this video today. So, can we in fact call this an appeal to authority? Is his book presenting itself falsely as authoritative on a topic that it is not authoritative on? Yes, this is appeal to false authority because Steven Pinker is operating outside his lane. He is not, in fact, an anthropologist or an archaeologist. He is an experimental psychologist. He should be staying in his lane. Always ask yourself when you read a study or you read a book, all right, who is this person? Are they, in fact, a real authority on this topic or not? And what do I make of that? Not an authority on this topic, shouldn't be believed. All right, so in chapter 7 of the book, what we are focused on this week, we have another example of terrible science, another psychologist who is engaged in really faulty science and who became crazy famous for it, one of the most famous psychologists of our days. His name is Philip Zimbardo from Stanford, and he is created the famous Stanford prison experiment. You can watch films on this, both documentaries and feature films on the Stanford prison experiment. But if you recall, they took 12 students and made them guards, and another 12 students and made them prisoners. And the guards stripped the prisoners naked, and then they treated them. They put them in cells and they treated them horribly. And Zimbardo said, hey, when I gave people the role of either guard or prisoner, just naturally the guards started to unleash their inner brute and become violent and cruel and torture these poor prisoners. It's just the natural course of things for the social role of guard to enable people to behave horribly and inflict pain on others. But what turned out to be true is that Zimbardo is in fact entirely wrong about his initial claim. He spread this idea that the experiment had naturally led some students to be really cruel and some students to be really traumatized, that it had just kind of emerged that way, and therefore it spoke to some inner traits that humans have, when in fact that wasn't the case. In fact, he carefully trained and carefully instructed the guards to behave in certain ways. He also really encouraged them when they did not want to be as cruel as possible. And he, in the cases of guards who really resisted, he really twisted their arms. And then his assistant Jaffe actually appealed to their better nature by saying that they would be helping this important cause in the form of prison reform if they would put their morals aside and participate and just do what they're told to do and be cruel to the prisoners. So it's not that there's this natural experiment where human nature emerges that the scientist is then able to capture and analyze. Instead, it's that the scientist is going in, just like Chagnon, and corrupting the experiment by insisting on people behaving in certain ways that he wants. So it's not that he is seeing something and inductively reasoning about it. Instead, he is creating that thing itself. So Zimbardo's experiment does not, in fact, prove what he claimed and is very famous for it proving. And if you've had a psychology class, you have undoubtedly encountered this experiment before, and you probably learned that it's true, when in fact the textbooks have not caught up with the most recent understanding, which is that Zimbardo's experiment was not believable and it was manipulated, and that other experiments later that have attempted to replicate his research have proven him to be wrong. They've gone in the opposite direction, that if guards and prisoners are given the opportunity, they will just behave like friends with each other. They're not going to naturally try and be on opposite sides or harm each other or be cruel to each other. So Zimbardo's experiment did not prove anything about taking on social roles like he thought it did. Instead, what did it prove? It proved, if you look closely at the full data from his experiment, it proved that humans, if you want them to do something cruel to another human, you mostly have to train them what they're going to do. You have to bully them into it or coerce them with paying them or with convincing them to, by telling them that they are doing something that's actually good for humanity. Their actions, even if they're uncomfortable, will have some higher good. So it doesn't show us anything that negative about human nature, other than that it wants to be kind and good for the most part, and you have to force it to not be that way if you want it to. So what his experiment showed is the opposite in many ways of what he said that it showed. Next up in our showcase of bad science, we have Stanley Milgram's shock machine, another very, very famous psychology experiment that if you've had a psychology class, you have probably learned about this. So Stanley Milgram was operating in Yale University right after the Nuremberg trials of the Nazis, who were responsible for killing millions and millions of Jews and Romas and gay people and Poles and others in World War II, but of course the bulk of those being Jewish people. And Stanley Milgram and the rest of the world were racking their brains trying to understand how everyday Germans could do such horrible, horrible things. How could they be caught up in this supremely evil plan of Hitler's to eradicate an entire set of people, the Jews and the Romas and the people with disabilities and gay people? How could normal everyday Germans go along with that, was the question. And Hannah Arendt, the famous philosopher, Jewish German philosopher, analyzed the ways in which this played out for certain Nazis, particularly Adolf Eichmann. And Stanley Milgram was really fascinated by her idea of the banality of evil and the idea that people can submit to authority figures. And he misinterpreted Hannah Arendt's philosophy to something quite simplistic, which is that humans will do what authority figures tell them to do. Humans submit to authority and therefore can be made to inflict horrible pain and suffering on others if they are told to by someone in authority. So in his experiment, they had an authority figure tell someone to shock someone on the other side of a wall and to increasingly increase the shock level until the person on the other side of the wall died. Pretty shocking thing to ask someone in an experiment to do. And Stanley Milgram found that there were a surprising number of people who were willing to complete the entire shock escalation until they actually went so far as to kill the person on the other side of the wall. Of course, the person on the other side of the wall was not, in fact, connected to the shock machine. Nobody was killed. They just acted that they were experiencing the shock, and they screamed louder and louder to let the person who was supposedly administering the shock feel as if they were inflicting pain when they weren't. And then the experiment was to watch what the person who was inflicting the pain did as they were increasingly asked to up the ante with the shock. So what was wrong about Milgram's science? What did he do badly? First of all, I mean, there was lots of ethical problems with what he did, of course, but one of the things that was so wrong about his research is that most of the people who were involved in the research, you could probably guess this, they didn't actually believe that they were shocking and killing someone on the other side of the wall. Like, the more it went on, they just started to go like, wait, I'm here at Yale and a scientist is asking me to kill someone for the purposes of an experiment? Like, does not compute. Don't think this is true. And so then they just kind of played along because they didn't actually believe it was what it purported to be. So that was a major problem with his research. But even for the people who did actually believe that what they were doing was inflicting a shock on another person, and then that person was feeling it, those people weren't actually submitting to an order. Instead, by and large, if you go back and study very carefully the notes that were taken, mostly what they thought they were doing was helping the scientist to progress human knowledge. They didn't think that they were just doing what they were told. They thought that they were joining in with the needs of humans and science. So they thought they were helping with the greater good, similar to some of the guards in Zimbardo's study, who were only able to do cruel things when they were coerced into it and then kind of manipulated into it emotionally by being told, hey, this is for the greater good. Do what we're telling you to do just because it's going to help us to create prison reform. So they did it for the prison reform. And in the case of Milgram's experiment, you could see people doing it for the science. They thought that this was helpful to the scientists. But by and large, there were very few people who, when they were directly ordered to do something that was harmful, acquiesced. Most of them, almost no one who got to that level, did it because they were told to. Instead, it was always an appeal to something like, help us out with this experiment, do the right thing, do the good thing, as opposed to, we are ordering you to inflict pain, therefore you must. It's, in fact, when they received a direct order, that they kicked it away and said, no, I'm not willing to. So Milgram's experiment didn't prove anything about human nature being that willing to obey orders and that disconnected from the good of the humans around them. In fact, what it showed was that humans want to help things that are important. They want to help science, they want to help good causes, they want to help society. And if they trust that that's in fact what they're accomplishing, then they can be made to do things that are not good. If they believe that they are good, they can be made to do things that are not good. It's just quite an interesting irony, right? Like, you can be made to do something bad if you actually think that thing is good. But that humans resist authority otherwise. They are, if you give them direct orders, they will basically give the big A big F you back. Okay, so there's other examples as well in the books. We have all these examples of bad science, both science that is disregarded, like in the case of Lindemann, or that is a misinterpretation of what is being seen, or is experiments that are actually manipulated and then misrepresented to the outside public for the purposes of the careers of the scientists themselves. So true for Napoleon Chagnon, true for all of these other scientists, especially now Zimbardo and Milgram that we read about. They were trying to advance their own careers. And so they put scientific methods aside and instead manipulated the science in order to get famous and become big in their fields. So if we ask ourselves about what we can learn from science here, we need to first of all realize that not all science is what it purports to be. There are a lot of biases that come into the making of science that we need to be really well aware of, and that even extremely famous scientists like Steven Pinker, like Philip Zimbardo, like Stanley Milgram, very famous names, can be entirely wrong. And sometimes because they're so famous, they have that much more reason to hide what they're doing for the sake of their careers. And that hanging our hat on any one famous scientist and what they have to say is a poor form of epistemology. It's not a good way to know what we know. We don't want to ever appeal to the authority of a single scientist because single scientists have a lot of biases, their career in particular, that can lead us astray. So if that's true, that we don't want to rely on just one scientist for what we believe, then how is it that we should operate instead? So whenever you come upon a new study, I want you to ask certain questions of that new study. Like you hear something in the news that says scientists have recently found that. So pause and ask certain questions about that research. First of all, academic qualifications. Does the person have a PhD in the exact thing that they claim to have expertise in, or are they Steven Pinker and they're operating outside their lane? Also, did that research go through a peer review process? So were there other researchers who were experts who looked at it and said, yes, this looks good? That's a necessary step to you being able to trust it. Then ask, okay, has it been replicated? It was done once. Did other scientists, not the same scientists, try and do it again? And did they come up with the same answer or not? So Zimbardo's work was never replicated until when they finally did try many, many years later to replicate it, they got the exact opposite results. So ask yourself that question of, all right, one study, has it been done again and again? And did they find the same thing over and over again? Then maybe I'll trust it. And then finally, has this question been submitted to a meta-analysis? So do we have lots and lots of studies compiled together that all are saying the same thing or not? Is there a wider consensus among scientists that this is true? Or is this one person saying this and a few other people that agree with them, but there's a whole body of other people that disagree with them? So ask about the broader field. And then ultimately, we have to figure out whether or not an idea that seems to have evidence to support it continues to have evidence and continues to be worthwhile after many, many years. So if an idea has stood the test of time, then we can feel a little bit more confident in believing it. For example, evolution. It has stood the test of time. There's ever increasing amounts of evidence that evolution is in fact the correct interpretation for changes over time in biology. So we can believe the theory of evolution, increasing amounts of evidence for that. Climate change, similarly true. But there are lots of ideas that are debated that in science and claimed by scientists that haven't yet risen to that level of certainty in the scientific community and through scientific consensus. Why is this all important? I want you to realize that although science doesn't always rise to the standard that it should, it does not always as accurate as it should be. We just went through all these terrible examples of faulty science. We still need to trust in the scientific process and in science more generally. That's still our best way to find out what's true in the world. And without that, then we are, as humans, basically left to wander in the epistemological wilderness and believe things like that COVID is, in fact, Bill Gates just attempting to microchip us, or to believe things like COVID is just the government's way of getting control in our lives. So I'm sure you have know, and maybe you are very familiar with people, maybe you are one of the people who believes that COVID was a hoax, or that COVID was intentional, or that COVID was not such a big deal as it was made out to be. None of those have good scientific evidence to support them. So the science around COVID that brought us to a sense of what it was and what needed to be done to tackle it were well-founded. And if we don't believe science, because we come up upon a few examples of bad science, or even multiple examples of bad science, if we don't believe the process as a whole, then we're left to just come up with our own, frankly, inaccurate theories of what's true in the world. We need science. Science is what has brought us to be able to confront things like mass pandemics, like COVID, and we need to then be able to assess better forms of science in order to keep us from believing falsehoods. Okay, so the whole book, of course, is about human nature, what it is to be human, in order for us to think about what's possible for us, what has been possible in the past for us, and what is going to continue to be possible for us in the future as humans. So what so far have we learned from this book of Bregman about human nature? So him pulling together, kind of in a meta-analysis, the various science that he was able to find and collate has brought us to several truths about human nature. We know, first and foremost, that humans are socially oriented. We're not individualistic first, and we're not self-motivated first. We're rather more collectivistic, oriented towards the group instead of being more individualistic. We tend to put the needs of the group above our own. And as part of that sociality that is key to us as a species, we're also copycats. We learn from each other. And that related social orientation, and then our ability to rapidly learn through that social orientation, have made us the rapid evolvers that we have become, that have then put us where we are in the planet, given us an evolutionary edge. We also know that humans are, although we're capable of reasoning and we can train ourselves to be better at reasoning, we are highly biased. Our nature is to be biased. We have negativity bias, which is common to all of us. We have availability bias. We're more likely to interpret what we experience through the stories that are available to us already. We have confirmation bias, where if we believe something, we want to hang on to that thing, and we're more likely to reject other information, etc. There's other ways in which we're biased, but we have a natural tendency, our nature is, to be biased in these directions. And one of those biases is that we are sociocentric. So we tend to think of the needs of our own social group and the ideas of our own social group as being more important than the needs and the ideas of outside social groups. So as we form and are oriented towards social groups, we have a tendency to towards forms of denigrating other social groups. We value our people and we devalue people outside our people. And this tendency towards hypervaluation of our own social group is a tendency of humans that can be manipulated by leaders to get us to inflict violence on outside groups. And this is one of the aspects of human nature that we both need to realize, and we also need to mitigate against it through understanding it, becoming exposed to this bias of ours, and learning to tamp it down, learning to offset our sociocentric biases, and in order to avoid the kind of horrors like the Holocaust. So why do humans then commit things like the Holocaust in the first place? If we've talked this whole semester so far about how we're so social, we're homo puppy, we're naturally oriented towards the group, and we want to put the group above ourselves, why do we do horrible things then? So what we learned from all of these examples, like the Stanford Prison Experiment, the Milgram Shock Experiment, and from Adolf Eichmann, not what they claim that we learned, but what we actually learn when we get down deep into the data, we learn that humans can be manipulated into doing cruel things if they think it's for the greater good and if they're indoctrinated into it. So that humans can be trained into cruelty, they can be manipulated into cruelty, they can be indoctrinated into cruelty. And all of these are usually oriented towards a form of sociocentrism where people want to do good for their group, even if that comes at the expense of another group. But they have to be convinced that it will, in fact, do something good for their group. Even Adolf Eichmann was not primarily a sociopath. He wasn't doing this for some personal pleasure. He was instead doing it because he was a fanatic who believed that this would be good for the German people. That's sociocentrism. He believed that this was part of some mythic historical course that the German people were on. And he was able to believe those kinds of things through heavy, heavy indoctrination. So why do humans commit harmful, violent acts? They are coerced into it, they are indoctrinated into it, and they believe that what they're doing is ultimately good for their own social group.